Thank you, Tony, for leading that song. It occurred to me when we were singing it, that song we just sang is a pretty good summary of the book of Daniel, believe it or not, which is where we're going to be tonight if you'd like to get out a Bible and turn there. Kings and kingdoms will all pass away, but there's something about that name. That is, in a lot of ways, what the book of Daniel is saying in its fullness, even as it points to Christ at the end. So I'm excited to get back into Daniel tonight. Tonight's lesson both is and is not a part of the series that we've been doing on Wednesday nights. I guess technically speaking, it's not, because in this series we've been studying the lives of two figures from the Old Testament, Joseph being one of them, and Daniel being the other one. And although this passage we're going to be looking at tonight comes from the book of Daniel, Daniel is not in it. Weirdly, he's not in it. It's kind of actually hard to explain, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So in that way, the passage does not fit with our series about Joseph and Daniel, because we're not going to see Daniel in our passage tonight. But I was talking with somebody about this passage last week after service, and I had kind of thought that maybe we would do it at the end of the series, because how do you preach on the book of Daniel and not do this passage? But then it just came to me to do it now, because although Daniel's not in this passage, if there's a passage in this book that fits with our theme on Wednesday nights, about how to live in this world and yet resist the temptation to be merely of it, then this one may be about the best we can get. This is a passage for navigating those difficult tensions we've been talking about living in a culture whose values clash with our own in many cases. And so it's a really fitting one for us to talk about. And it's also just an exciting one to preach about, because the last thing just about that gets said at the end of this chapter, somebody looking on at what has happened here says, "No other God could save like this." It's Daniel chapter 3. It starts with King Nebuchadnezzar. You remember him from chapter 2. He had that dream. Well, here we have King Nebuchadnezzar again. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. And we're only 7 words into the chapter, and I already would like to have an explanation. I've got a question here. Image of what? Made an image of gold of what? Anybody know? Personally, I'm one of those people that would like to visualize the things that I read about, the events and the environments of the Bible. It's always important to me to try to picture what's really going on here. And unless I have something to picture, I think I'm going to find myself thinking of that bunny from the VeggieTales version of this story, and I don't think that's what it was of. So what is this image of here? I've always thought of it as being a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Is that what you're picturing in your mind too? I've always pictured him making a statue of himself, making everybody else bow down to it. I mean, after all, we just finished in chapter 2, and Nebuchadnezzar had that dream. And in his dream, he dreamed about a statue that kind of resembles a king-like figure. It's certainly a human-like figure with a head and a torso and legs and feet. And at the top of it, you remember there was that head of gold. And Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar that that head of gold represented him. His kingdom was like the head of gold upon this statue. So I guess I've always had it in my mind that, Nebuchadnezzar, inspired by this dream, makes this big, giant statue of himself made out of gold and tells everybody else to just bow down to him. Big, giant statue. Big, giant statue. It says 60 cubits high, 6 feet wide, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. For reference, that's like twice the size of Big Tex at the state fair. So I'm picturing this 90-foot tall, solid gold Nebuchadnezzar with or without a cowboy hat. And he tells him to bow down to this. What I've never thought about till I was doing some study this week, what I've never thought about is the fact that the Bible never actually tells us what it's a statue of. Do you know that? It could have been Nebuchadnezzar. Could have. It also could have been a Babylonian god. Could have been something that represented Babylon, the nation, and people's allegiance to it. It might have been something, Babylon draws in all these different captives and people from all over the place. It might have been some sort of image that was built up so that people could think of their own personal gods and worship together at this image of the statue. It's possible. Actually brings us to another thing. One thing you're going to notice as you go further into this chapter, familiar as it is that never at any point is anyone told to denounce their own personal convictions that they believe in. Babylon's this city, this place filled with different people from all over the place. It's multinational. Many of them are captives brought here, just like the Jews. But Nebuchadnezzar does not say they have to stop believing in their gods, the gods of their homeland. The Jewish captives in Babylon do not have to denounce the God of the Hebrews, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They can continue to worship him in that little private compartment of their life called their home. But in the public world, in the public sphere, something else is expected of them. They're expected to participate in the pluralism. They're expected to participate in the worship of many gods in Babylon. And to participate like this. Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, a title, you name it, they're all here. All of the provincial officials to come to the dedication of this image that he set up. So verse 3 tells us that they all come. Verse 4, then a herald loudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and basically any musical instrument you can think of, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So you see this situation that's brewing here has a whole lot less to do with what the statue is of. We don't know what the statue was of. But there's an even bigger issue at play. It has everything to do with whether or not one's faith can be made a matter of strictly private preference. It's strictly a private thing. Nebuchadnezzar, at least here, doesn't seem to have an issue with people having their little private preferences in their home. But by making this rule, Nebuchadnezzar is saying, you serve me too. And you serve other gods here too. You serve me and my gods out here in public, at your work, and in society. When you're out here, you play by my rules. You can let your gods be your own little gods in your own little kingdom of your house. Your private life, that has nothing to do with the rest of us. But when it comes to the way you live out here in society, you live by other rules. You'll worship our gods here too. You'll bow down wherever I want you to bow down. When the music plays, you'll bow down. And when it stops, kind of like musical chairs, you don't want to be left standing when it stops. Because whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace, verse 6 says. So the stage is set. Some of you know this story quite well. But I want you to think about the mounting pressure. This sort of pressing question for people of faith to answer, which is like, exactly where does my allegiance to God begin and where does it end? Is the Lord Lord of all of it? Where is the Lord Lord in my life? Only over here in this one little compartment of my life? Or over it all? What does it mean for the Lord to be Lord over it all? Well, that's what a handful of faithful Hebrews are about to have to work out real quick. So the herald proclaims these rules. This is what you're going to do. The music begins. And verse 7, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn and the flute and the zither and the lyre and the harp and all kinds of music, all the nations and the people of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And it's at this point that some astrologers, you might remember them as being part of that collection of wise Babylonians from last chapter. Some astrologers come forward and they denounce the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty's issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn and the flute and the zither and the lyre and the harp and the pipe and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you set over affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you set up." Now, there are two things I kind of want to point out about this little thing that just happened here with the astrologers. One of them is that these tattle-tailing guys, these whistleblowers, are about as low as it gets. Because if you remember just last chapter, every last one of them would have been taken out by a different decree of the king, were it not for the faith of Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, who sought the Lord's counsel about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had had that none of the other wise men could explain. They sought the Lord's counsel on this. God revealed to Daniel what the dream was all about. Daniel has the courage to go before the king and share this dream. And because of these guys and their faith, all those other folks, their lives are spared from the decree that the king had given, and no sooner have their own lives been spared than they find the first opportunity to take another decree of the king and turn it around against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's pretty low. That's a pretty harsh thing to do. The other thing I want to point out with this, and I said this before, it's kind of confusing why Daniel's not in this mix. Right? You've probably wondered that before if you've read this. You're going to keep wondering it because all we have are guesses. It's hard to know why Daniel's not a part of this. Some people have wondered whether Daniel bowed down and that's why he's not a part of it. I just don't think that's probably the guess I would make. I don't think that's the best guess. If you had to ask me, the one that I think is probably the best is that Daniel, more so than the other three, has really won favor with the king. I mean, he's the one of those four that went before the king and asked for more time, and he's the one that God gave the dream to, and he's the one that explained it to the king. So my guess, if I had to guess, and it's just a guess, is that these whistleblower guys, they already know that the king favors Daniel, and they don't want to get on the bad side of the king by trying to throw Daniel under the bus. But these other guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they turned them in right away. That's all we know for sure, is that they're the ones that get sold out. Because when the music stops, they're not bowing down with all the rest. And this makes Nebuchadnezzar really angry. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. So the men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up?" And he's going to explain the rules to them one more time. I'll give you one more chance. When you hear the sound of the horn and the flute and the zither and the lyre and the harp and the pipe and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And if that happens, don't forget this line. If that happens, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you set up." And to me, in all the Bible, this has got to be like one of the bravest, most compelling expressions of faith that you can find anywhere in the whole book. Really think about the kind of faith that's being shown here, what that faith is like. I want to sit with this part of the story for a minute and really dwell on the kind of faith we see in it. I want to point out two things that this faith is not, and one thing that it is. So, first of all, the faith we see here, it is not contingent. Not contingent. Like, not contingent upon the outcome of things. You remember what they said, right? Go back to it. If we're thrown into the furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us. But notice how they say, even if it's not that outcome. If their faith were contingent upon the outcomes, it might sound something like this. We will believe in God. We're going to keep on bowing down to him only. Only if, or so long as, he keeps us out of this mess. We'll keep bowing down to him and worshiping him if God protects us, and if things go well for me, and if I'm comfortable, and if I'm blessed, and if I'm happy, and if I don't have to suffer these things, then yeah, he's my Lord, and we'll worship him. That's what it might sound like if faith is contingent. Contingent upon my benefit, my comfort, what I have to gain from all this. Things going according to my plan. Those are all contingencies we might put on things. But the faith we see from these guys is most definitely not that. It's not contingent upon the outcome. They have a great confidence in the outcome, but it's not contingent on that. It's not a faith that says, I'm with you, Lord, only if. And it's also not a faith that is compartmentalized. By this, I mean to talk about that public-private thing we were talking about earlier. What Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say here is that the Lord who is Lord over our private lives, our personal convictions, is still Lord out here too. When we go out into the world, in the public square, when we work at our work, which, by the way, was work for the king, in the king's government, and we're going to talk more about that in the next couple of weeks, that engagement with the world. But when we engage with the world, the Lord is still Lord over us. And so the last thing they say is, we're just not going to do it. We're not going to serve your gods. We're not going to worship the image of gold that you set up, because to do so would be to limit the Lord to being Lord over just one part of me only, instead of Lord over all of it, all of me, all the places and spaces in my life. So this faith is not contingent. It's not one that says, I've got faith in you only if you do this, if the outcome's what I want. It's also not compartmentalized. It's not, I'll have faith with you only when I'm here by myself or when I'm around like-minded folks. It's not only when it's like a comfortable place for me to be faithful. It's not just one part of my life. It's not just if. It's not just when. It's faith that says, even if. Even if. In other words, to this faith there is contentment. It's a faith that is content. That was our word from Sunday when we were talking about Philippians. Content. How are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego content? They're content to let God be their God. They don't feel any need to add any other gods to it. They're content to let God be God regardless of where it is, public or private. They're content to let God be God and let his outcomes come. That's contentment. What they say to the king is, we sincerely believe that God's going to deliver us from your hand, but even if he does not, even if he does not, he's still our God. We're still going to side with him. We are content to worship him alone. To put all our eggs in this one basket. That he is the Lord of Lords. I think that's the kind of faith we see in these three and their answer. And isn't that what faith is meant to be like? Isn't that what my faith is meant to grow up to be like? What I'd like for it to be more of in my life. Because when our faith is not contingent, and when our faith is not compartmentalized, when it's not just only if, and if it's not just only when our faith becomes content that God is God, and we can say, even if, then what can come along and shake our faith then? Who can shake us then? Who's going to get the better of us? When our faith can say, even if, that's when our faith can survive, even if. And you can fill in the blank with all number of things. Even when the heat gets turned up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed, he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes. This is really a listing chapter. I hope you've noticed that by now. These men, wearing all these different things, bound them and threw them into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." So Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble." This is like a favorite threat of Nebuchadnezzar. "For no other God can save in this way." Let me say one last thing about this last thing that gets said here, and then I'll be through for tonight. No other God can save in this way. That statement turns out to be really perceptive. I think it turns out to be true in a much deeper way than the obvious way that it's true. So we Christians believe that there are no other gods. So it should be pretty obvious that there is no other God who can save in this way because, that all these other gods that people call gods, they're not really gods. They can't save anything. So of course, there's no other God that can save in this way. But I think this statement he makes is actually truer on a deeper level. Talking about the way that God saves. So they look into the furnace and they see not 3 men, there's 4. They look and they see someone like an angel in there. Someone like a son of the gods is present with them. Who is that? I don't know. One of the words you often see to describe what's happening here is the word theophany. Theophany is a word for the manifestation of God or the appearance of God on the earth. Since the very early days of reading these verses, there's been conjecture that the 4th figure in the flames may be none other than Christ himself. Christ before he became incarnate and became Jesus Christ. I don't know if we can say that for sure. But whatever you can decide about this 4th mysterious figure in the flames, we Christians do believe in theophany. We believe in God's appearance in the world. And when it came time for our ultimate rescue, God did not attempt that rescue from far off. but he put himself in harm's way for our sake. And to say that no other God could save like this, that no other God could save in this way, is actually truer than Nebuchadnezzar could possibly know. Because in the fullness of time, God himself would surrender his own life. He would take up a human body and give it up for our sake. And what he did for us was not contingent upon whether or not we believed in him or praised him for it or regarded him or even acknowledged him at all. What he did for us was not compartmentalized to just like one certain type of person or people who were worthy of his grace and love. It was not just limited to those people who had already gotten their lives together and proven how worthy they were of what God did for them. What Christ did when he came was say not only if or only when, but even if. And no other God saves like that. That's what makes our God special. Maybe that's the reminder you need tonight. That God was willing to come and give his life and enter into the pressure cooker of life here on this earth for the possibility that people might come to him. And he was willing to do that even if a great many people did not. But his love for us was such that he was willing to say, even if, and come anyway. Maybe you need to respond to that tonight. The gospel is our response to that. And when we respond to the gospel and when we live our lives as Christians, we're learning to say, even if, in our life of faith. Because our commitment is supposed to be the kind that says those words in the way we live each day. Whatever may come, we're trying to have a faith like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that says, even if, I'll put my trust in you. Maybe that's what you need to work on tonight as well. However you might be called or challenged by this example. Let's respond while we stand and sing.